Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting live broadcast. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your host, founder of Thrive Meetings and Events, and this podcast. And on the Eating at a Meeting podcast, we talk to experts about all facets of food and beverage, from chefs to diners to doctors and everyone in between, about sustainability and how to provide safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for all of our attendees, all of our guests. This podcast launched last year, and this January, you need to check it out. I also launched to go with it a course called Every Meal Matters. And you can find out more about that course at academy.thrivemeetings.com. And we delve a lot into all the different dietary needs and how to manage them. But today we're going to focus on talking about, it is Veganary month, so promoting veganism. And my guest today, she and her organization, the Better Food Foundation, really focus on putting vegetables and fruits forward and making sure that that's what we're thinking about first. So Laura Lee Cascada is the campaigns director for the Better Food Foundation, and where she works to make institutional food menus more inclusive and sustainable through an innovative strategy called Default Veg. And I love that concept. She has over a decade of experience in environmental and food advocacy and has helped major brands like Starbucks and Nestle introduce plant-based options into their menus. She's a master's degree in environmental policy from Johns Hopkins University up in Baltimore, where I used to live. So welcome, Laura Lee.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
I am so glad that I found you. And I don't even remember how I Googled it and found you, but I'm so glad I did. So tell the listeners, what is the Better Food Foundation and what's your mission?
The Better Food Foundation is a national nonprofit organization that is working for a more sustainable, just, and equitable food system. So we, try to achieve that goal through a number of means, including policy change, teaming up with a broad, diverse array of organizations and stakeholders to amplify, especially Brown, Black, and Indigenous voices in the food system, worker voices, and really just make transformational change to our food system that, of course, centers healthy and sustainable plant-based foods.
That's awesome. And you mentioned the Blacks and the Indigenous networks or communities, and they have a hard time getting a lot of fresh plant-forward, fruits and vegetables. They're in a lot of food deserts. So how does the organization help fight food deserts and educate them on the benefits and reasons to eat plants and plant-based foods?
Yeah, definitely. Food deserts and food apartheids are a huge problem in this country. And I think, some communities are intentionally targeted by big ag and big fast food messaging and advertising that really prevents them from getting access to healthy, sustainable foods. And, sometimes the only grocery store they have access to is like a dollar store. It's really unfortunate. The Better Food Foundation works through a number of means. Like I said, first of all, we do policy advocacy. We also do grant making ourselves to reallocate resources toward Black, Indigenous, and also religious-led organizations, like Jewish and Christian-led organizations, just because we know that those groups are most able to advocate in their own communities. And so we want to help amplify their own voices. We also lead partnerships with some of those groups through our Default Veg program, which I know we'll get into in a minute. And Default Veg really does address a lot of those inequities and the lack of inclusivity in the food system simply using defaults.
Okay, so that was a question I asked you before we got on here, and I just like the whole word Default Veg, is that it's about choice and it's about how defaults shape our culture. And I think you answered it in two different questions on there, but can you talk about how that came about and then exactly kind of what Default Veg is?
Yeah, definitely. So defaults are, the things we live with every day, the things we're accustomed to, our norms, and they really shape our everyday life. So, when you go into a restaurant now or go to an event, usually the default is beef or chicken. So that's, the default that we've been accustomed to. But this default can actually be very harmful because we're inundated with messages from big food giants that really their main interest is making profits, and that often comes at the expense of the environment and of workers. Especially, we've seen that a lot this year in slaughterhouses with COVID-19 breakouts or outbreaks, and the workers still being forced to come into work, and hundreds of them have lost their lives, and it's really terrifying. And so this harmful default that we've sort of been fed our entire lives, excuse the pun, but it is really something that Default Veg aims to turn on its head. And so Default Veg is the simple concept of setting a new default, and that default is centering plants. And again, it is about choice. So it doesn't mean you have to eat 100% plants all the time, but it just sort of restructures what we think of as the norm. And these defaults are incredibly impactful and powerful. Like when you think about in some countries like the US, where you're registering to become an organ donor, you by default are not registered when you get your driver's license. At least when I here in Virginia, where I live, you get your driver's license and it asks you to check a box if you want to become an organ donor. So the default is not an organ donor, and the actual people who sign up and check the non-default, like go the other way, it's very small. But in other countries in Europe where you're automatically made an organ donor and you have to check a box to opt out, it's sort of this behavioral nudge kind of comes into play where people just want to pick the default because it's the most comfortable thing. It's the thing they're used to. So actually those countries in Europe see a much higher rate, can be like 98% of people who actually remain organ donors just because that's the default choice and they don't want to do something that's not the default. So Default Veg works very similarly in that it makes the plants the default option. And of course, people can opt out, they can choose other options, but it really kind of starts your brain thinking about, what if our world looked different? What if plants were central on the plate?
Well, that's interesting. It reminds me of a couple of things, but Chef Murray Hall in Toronto, and helping incorporate more plant-forward, plant-based menus, he actually is defaulting to a vegan vegetarian dish and then making the add-on or the accompaniment the meat, or whether it's a protein, vegan protein, or whether it's the chicken or the beef or the fish. So he's leaning that way. So it's plant forward or default veg, while he's designing these banquet menus. And he said it made his thinking about menu items, much simpler. And, and you don't have to, and healthier across the board for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a really, I think, great example of Default Veg in action. And it's a really flexible strategy. On one hand, it's a big overarching concept that we can put into play in our daily lives and in our communities. And on the other hand, it's a very flexible strategy that institutions and event planners and basically anyone can use for any setting. And it works. It works in so many different ways. Like you can be at an institution like a dining hall and put the stations, the build your own taco stations or whatever. You can put the plant-based options like the tofu or the vegan chorizo at the front, and then the beef or chicken at the back. So it's just about making subtle shifts in the placement that really push people's eyes toward the plant-based options without making them feel like they've been deprived of anything. And really that can amount to about, we've seen with case studies, about an 80% or so on average shift toward the plant-based option. So that it really helps people's arteries and their heart health. It can help be preventative against diseases like cancer and diabetes. And it's also just really a lot more inclusive because 30 to 50 million Americans are suffering from lactose intolerance, for example. So offering the plant-based options first it makes it a lot easier for people who do have dairy allergies or lactose intolerance to find their option really quickly and pick it. And that condition is really prevalent in like the African American community, Hispanic Americans, Jewish Americans, anywhere from like 60 to 80% of people in those communities suffer from lactose intolerance. So just, at a coffee bar, putting the plant-based milk out as the default instead of the regular milk can really go a long way toward helping solve some of those issues.
Well, then that reminds me of putting that out. There was a couple of buffets that I've seen. This is probably 2019. We're just going to scrap to 2020. And, they had the milk, they had the almond milk in one canister and the regular milk in another canister, but the only label for them was the card in front of them. The canisters looked exactly the same. So if you and I went up the coffee bar to pick those up and we just put them back down, who knows which one is which? And like you said, that almond milk could actually be, harmful to somebody who has a nut allergy or whatever. So I love having those out there, but we also have to think about a different way of labeling them, making sure the canisters are different, pointing it out, or the label is on the canister, not on the buffet table. That's just a whole nother side thing there. But in my Every Meal Matters course this week, we're talking about the needs, the wants, and the request. And, I was mentioning with vegan and vegetarian is that we do need to start with the vegan, first and foremost, and then even, like you said, make the cheeses as that add-on that people can put onto that to make it safer as well as potentially healthier for some individuals.
Yeah, and that's a really good example too, like just adding on the cheese so it's not default in the dish. And we've also seen, restaurants like Just Salad. That's a really cool example where they have changed one of their chicken bowls recently so that now the vegan chicken is the default, and then you have to opt in to get the meat-based chicken. And you can do the same thing with cheese or dairy products too, where they don't just automatically come on, but people who want them can add them on.
Okay, so yesterday I saw some article about some guy that complained. He went into a restaurant and didn't see the big sign out front that says plant-based, or it doesn't say vegan anywhere, it just says plant-based, and the menu items are there. And he wrote a review on the restaurant website because he was mad. He gobbled up all of his appetizers, and then when his burger came out, it was plant-based burger. And he got mad, and he paid and left and said it was an emergency, and he went to McDonald's and bought a real burger. But the manager replied back going, I'm not sure how you could know that everything in our restaurant was plant-based, because it pretty much says it everywhere. But the manager said you ate everything until you got to the burger, right? So that's just another thought process too, is that we all eat vegan or plant-based a lot without even thinking about it. And we just need to make sure that that thought process is more default than it is, as the main dish. Does that? Yeah.
That story is really insane. I've never heard about that happening, but that's nuts. And there's some really creative menu tricks that our Default Veg consultants can help restaurants and event planners with to help them kind of guide how they display the menus. And, we don't need to put, like you said, it doesn't have to say vegan, but like if you're centering something, it might be like light, crispy green bean, whatever, it doesn't have to be like vegan green beans, because that doesn't sound as exciting. But also another trick is to make the menu so that the vegan options are just there, and then anything that's not vegan is labeled. And so people would clearly know just by seeing like, oh, this dish is not vegan, but it does put the vegan ones up front and center. But I don't think anyone would get confused about what is what.
Right. Yeah. The only thing that would be the challenge is, again, if you're using nuts or something like that. So you need to say it contains nuts.
Right.
But yeah.
There are so many great alternatives that don't use nuts now, because I know that that's another big allergy. So oat milk and hemp milk and rice milk are great. And, that avoids soy too, because some people have soy sensitivities. So there's definitely an array of options to be as inclusive as possible.
So with some of the, when looking at an event and changing institutional menus, and that would be, convention center menus, hotel menus, things like that. What success have you seen with that?
Yeah. So, one easy, really simple way to do it when looking at an event is like when somebody registers for a conference, say, or any kind of event, you've got the registration form, and normally it might say something like, check here for the beef option, check here for the chicken option. And then at the little very bottom, it's like, check here if you need the vegan. So it just sort of flips around and maybe provides 2 or 3 really delicious, like vegan chicken Alfredo or whatever, as the main choices. And then at the bottom might be check here if you would like the meat or the chicken or beef, actual chicken or beef, not plant-based. But so that's a really easy thing to do. It doesn't require a lot of work. The event planner can just incorporate that into the actual registration form. And then it's just a matter of, fulfilling how many people order what. And we started out in 2019 when we first launched this program in the US. It was actually over in the UK before with an organization called Creature Kind, getting a lot of great successes with Default Veg, especially in the college setting and lots of religious institutions, Christian-based institutions, because Creature Kind is a Christian-based animal advocacy organization. But we brought it over here to the US, and our first focus was these conferences because they're such an easy setting to implement it. And so we had couple dozen conferences right away, maybe about 30 or so, just adopting Default Veg for their meal strategy. And it was super simple and easy to implement. Obviously with the pandemic, things have slowed down a bit with that. And so now we're kind of working behind the scenes on getting commitments to use this strategy from institutions and organizations for their future events. We're also working with cities across the country to try to get Default Veg implemented into their climate action plans as a strategy to help them meet their targets. A lot of them have, we'll try to we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by this date. And so trying to actually use Default Veg as a tool for that. So every time the cities have a meeting or, a catering order or anything like that, they can just use the strategy and it'll help contribute to that goal. So we're working up toward a lot of long-term planning for when events and everything do open back up, people will be ready with these new approaches.
Now, have you gotten any pushback from people on this? Because, there's people that are like, oh, our whole group is meat and potatoes kind of people. This is what they eat. How do you help transition that and make it easy to do that because there are a lot of people who don't follow vegan or plant-based diets across the board. And actually a statistic I saw recently was really only 3% of the United States, which is not a lot of people who are following vegan-based diets, but it doesn't mean that it's not growing. And I think COVID has implemented or, pushed that forward a lot more.
Yeah, definitely. I think that one of the most common misconceptions when people first hear about the program is it's too radical, it's just too extreme. Maybe just that they can't imagine totally, turning things on their heads and having a vegan meal instead of featuring meat and potatoes. And that's definitely understandable because what we are trying to do is promote a cultural shift. And, that takes, one institution at a time and it builds up into something bigger. But I think that, we do emphasize the choice aspect. So really they can still have their meat and potatoes. It doesn't have to take away anything. It just kind of restructures the menus, restructures the choices. But if they still want that, they could still get it. Another thing is that, menus can be so complex and so different from restaurant to institution to school to cafe. It's so different in every setting. And so we try to offer little steps that can be taken. Like a restaurant might just start by like how Just Salad did with their one chicken dish, and they turned that into a vegan chicken dish. So it didn't have to be their whole menu at first. and maybe they'll start by just adding a few more vegan options and putting them at the top of their menu and shifting the non-vegan ones to the bottom. So it's a lot of like subtle shifts that can really add up. So it doesn't have to be this grand transformational thing right at first. And I think that's really helped folks understand that it's a really flexible and it can be adapted into really any setting.
Okay, so I have a question. So it's vegan chicken or vegan beef or vegan fish. And there was something some article I posted into the Facebook group a couple of weeks ago, and somebody commented, they need to stop saying, remove the, what was it? Remove the word vegan from it, because and this is where some states have instituted that you can't actually say, I think Mississippi has a law that you can't promote plant-based foods, or pitch them as I don't know what the wording of it is.
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say? But why do we have to say that it's vegan chicken? Does that make sense? Let's just go that way. Right.
Yeah. So I know that there's been a lot of attempts around the country and even nationally to like ban the use of words like meat when they are describing a plant-based product, and also milk. That was a big effort by the dairy industry because they're afraid that plant-based milks are going to come in and take over. So they were trying to get the word milk banned from like soy milk, almond milk, and I guess it would have to be called like soy beverage. So that's definitely a trend. I don't think that consumers are actually, like, their argument is that consumers are confused about what they're buying. I don't think there's any evidence that shows that. I don't think we have to worry that when people buy soy milk, they think they're getting actual dairy cow milk. So I do think that that's just an attempt by the industry because they're concerned about this competition. But yeah, with regarding like describing it as like vegan chicken, I definitely would recommend not doing that with menus, because that can turn off diners when you just throw the word vegan in. Some people are like, oh, I don't know about that, unfortunately. So, there are ways to get around that. You might just describe it as like beef ravioli with a certain kind of sauce, and then underneath it you might say this is plant-based beef, or contains no animal product, something like that. And if you choose to do the approach where you're listing all the options that are plant-based just as is, and then you mark options that are not plant-based, you could have like a little asterisk next to all the ones that are not plant-based, and then at the bottom say like, anything with an asterisk means it's not plant-based. And so then people would understand that everything else, even if it says beef or chicken or whatever, is actually the plant-based version. So you don't necessarily have to say big and bold vegan chicken.
Right. Yeah. Because those two words don't really actually go together,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really kind of rethinking how we write all of our menus and how we present the information to individuals, because it does come down to transparency as well and trust.
Yeah.
And
I think another big thing is that we don't, say that everyone needs to add the vegan substitutes like the vegan chicken and vegan beef. I mean, those are great for people who are so used to eating, a heavy animal product-based diet, but there's also beans and tofu and lentils and grains and quinoa and all these great just whole plant-based ingredients. And we love that. And on our Default Veg recipe tool, which is at defaultveg.org, and you can click the recipe tab, we are the web's largest search engine for all plant-based recipes. So anything you type in to search there, it'll bring up a plant-based recipe. And it actually is an aggregator, so it brings it all together from different sources, and then you can click out to go to the original source. So it's, giving credit to all the different cookbook authors and recipe authors. And there you'll see it's really low, not heavy on the Beyond Beef and all of that stuff. We really like to feature the whole grains and whole proteins and plant-based ingredients, and just really encourage, that kind of healthy and clean eating.
Yeah, because that's one of the other challenges, because there's a bunch of different conferences out there that, they have vegan options, and I'm not discounting prepackaged food because we do live in a world of convenience.
Sure.
But using whole food plant-based is so much healthier, but it does take some effort. And that's where, going back to originally, you know, with the Black and the indigenous and religious-based communities, a lot of them don't have the tools or the knowledge of how to use real food, you know, to make that. And when we're pushing that, I think that's another level of education that we need to provide besides just eating whole food plant-based.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely where our partnerships come in, like with the Black Vegetarian Society of Maryland, the Afro Vegan Society, other organizations like that, where they can really help tailor, like we can work with them to create recipe collections for their audiences. They can conduct, you know, cooking demonstrations and work one-on-one with restaurants to help them adapt their menus. And so that's a really great way for people who are in, you know, the African-American community and have that kind of knowledge and understand what foods people are seeking and, you know, where, you know, the lack of access might be, that they can actually come in and help provide those insights and tips and information.
There was a really good article that I found yesterday, and I haven't finished reading it, in Eater, on eater.com, about the Afro vegan movement and actually how it's been around for a long time. But, you know, the writer was saying, you know, her family was like, how can you not eat, you know, the stuff that we're used to eating? But she said, you know, going back into history, it's been really prevalent, actually. It just, you know, lack of access to that food is one of the biggest challenges.
Definitely. And I think it's such a, you know, a timely issue right now. And reading, you know, some of these Black vegan scholars like AFCO and Silco, like just learning about the systemic oppression that the Black community has faced and how this really can be connected to the exploitation in the food industry, like with workers and, you know, marginalized communities that are deprived of healthy foods, and slaughterhouse workers and farm workers, like these same systems that are, you know, causing a lot of the oppression we're seeing right now in our communities are very tied into environmental racism and food system issues for sure.
So somebody just posted on the Facebook thing that Afro vegans have brought today's movement to where it is. Yeah. And I just posted that Eater magazine eater.com article on there in the chat. So that's really good. And then this person said they deserve all of the props.
Yes, I agree.
Which is, I just love it because it's figuring out that, you know, we all have to eat, right? And we can all share in this, and we can all share in our history, no matter where we come from, what our, you know, background is, what race that we are. This can actually help a lot of us in a variety of different ways. I remember the indigenous community is also very is fighting diabetes and a lot of other medical conditions because of their diet. And so I know there's a lot of work in those communities across the country to help fight diabetes with getting rid of all the prepackaged junk that's in their mini grocery stores, you know, and teaching them how to cook back to their indigenous ways.
Yeah, we actually wrote a piece around Thanksgiving about kind of thinking about the holidays and how to create a more resilient new normal through something like Default Veg, and featured how in the indigenous community, they're working on decolonizing your holiday, decolonizing your Thanksgiving. So looking at like what foods are actually representative of indigenous culture. And, you know, they have largely centered plant-based ingredients, not exclusively, but just getting back to their roots and not necessarily feeling like they have to have a turkey at the center of their table just because that's, you know, what US, you know, tradition has evolved into, but really reconnecting with what foods are nourishing to their culture and to their bodies. And I think that fits nicely with Default Veg because it is such an inclusive approach and really can be tailored to, you know, any different community or ethnicity or demographic.
Yeah, and all those indigenous grains and some fruits and vegetables that, you know, kind of have disappeared, but they're learning how to, you know, bring those back heirloom wise and save some of those vegetables and fruits that their ancestors grew. And it's thinking, getting grandpa to talk to you about what he ate way back when, or grandma, what she made, and bring that into what you're eating now. And I think that's awesome. The brand Siete, which, is made from cassava flour. And I love that family story and the woman who started it, but I want to say she had celiac disease, or she had another immune disease, and she was really hesitant to change her grandmother's recipes, to incorporate gluten-free versions of it. But when her grandmother gave her the A-OK that these tortillas and these things, meet my standards, so it's jumping a couple of generations to saying, hey, yeah, this does work. So
wow.
That's a different twist.
That's a really great and versatile ingredient. And also on our recipe tool, you can search gluten-free, and have a big collection come up that's just all gluten-free, plant-based. So it works with a lot of different dietary needs.
Yeah, just starting with real food helps that in general. Sure. Yeah. So please learn about Fonio, Fonio. Okay, I need to look that up. Thank you for
familiar with it.
Yeah, I've never heard that term, so I will definitely look it up. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so I always ask everybody. I did share the links already to the Default Veg recipe search engine, as well as to the what is the guide, right? The PF guide. But what else do you want people to know about Default Veg? How can they implement it or work with you?
Yeah. So the best thing to do would be to go to our website, which I know you've linked, defaultveg.org. And we have under one of the tabs, we've got something that says ambassador. And if you click that, that's where you can sign up and actually get involved. And so becoming an ambassador is really a fancy name, but it's a really simple process. You can become a change maker in your community. So if you are an event organizer, or you volunteer with a club, or you have an office space, eventually we will be back in our office spaces, you can actually use Default Veg as a tool in those spaces. And so we provide you with trainings, webinars, the resource guide, and we have office hours to chat with you, and can just guide you on your way to how you can implement Default Veg as a strategy in your community or for your own events.
Okay, awesome. And then I always ask all of my guests, what is your favorite food and beverage?
So I would have to say my favorite food is vegan mac and cheese, and I just love it. And it can be made so many different ways. It can be made with cashews. If you have a nut allergy, it can be made with just a bunch of different veggies and herbs and spices, blended together, onions, potatoes, different herbs and spices, or nutritional yeast if you like that. So there's so many different ways to make vegan mac and cheese.
Awesome. And then I think you'd written coconut caramel latte.
Oh, yeah. I love coffee. I actually discovered a new latte. If you're not a coffee fan, this brand called Daily Harvest, which I love, and they're all pretty much whole foods, plant-based. They make this chaga mushroom and chocolate latte. And so I add a little coconut milk in there, and it's so good. And in case I already had too much coffee for the day. So that's so delicious.
Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the Eating at a Meeting podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really fun.
We need to default to vegetables, whole food, plant-based vegetables on our menus and our diets across the board, just so that we can all be healthier, because I want to see everybody a lot longer than when we do. So again, links to Default Veg and betterfoodfoundation.org are on the chat here. So definitely check them out. Thank you for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast today. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I've also launched an online course called Every Meal Matters, and you can check that out at academy.thrivemeetings.com. Thanks for being here, and until next time.